The goats had eaten almost everything. 3 months earlier, this hillside had been buried beneath thorn, blackberry, and waist-high weeds. Now, most of that vegetation was gone. 30 goats moved slowly across the slope, their coats cleaner and their bodies noticeably stronger than when they had arrived. But Daniel wasn't watching the goats. He was staring at the ground. He had just pulled away a mat of dead weeds when he noticed a line of stones beneath the dirt. At first, he thought they were ordinary rocks, the kind that had been sitting on the property for decades. But as he brushed away more soil, he realized the stones were arranged in a straight line that ran across the hillside. It wasn't random. Daniel stood up and looked across the slope. For the first time, he noticed something he had somehow missed during the 2 years he'd owned the property. The hillside didn't seem to fall naturally all the way down. There were faint, flat lines running across it, almost like enormous steps hidden beneath the vegetation. And suddenly, the $60 he'd spent on 30 starving goats didn't seem quite so foolish. 3 months earlier, everyone had thought it was. The goats had been standing in a muddy pen behind an old barn. There were 30 of them, with thin ribs, patchy coats, and weak-looking legs. Some barely lifted their heads when Daniel approached. The owner wanted them gone. All 30 for $60. Daniel didn't bargain, he paid. When his cousin heard about the purchase that night, he laughed. "You paid $60 for those." Daniel simply shrugged. "I need the hillside cleared." His cousin laughed again. "You'll spend more feeding them than they're worth." Maybe he was right, Daniel wasn't sure. He wasn't buying the goats because he believed they were valuable animals. He was buying them because 12 acres of his property were almost impossible to clear with a tractor. The slope was too rough, too steep, and too overgrown. Every summer, the weeds came back thicker, and Daniel needed a way to clear the land without spending a fortune on machinery and fuel. So he figured 30 goats could do what his equipment couldn't. Eat, climb, and keep eating. That was the entire plan. There was no hidden discovery in his mind, no grand agricultural experiment, and certainly no expectation that those goats would uncover anything important. He simply needed cheap labor. The first week was rough. The goats barely moved, and Daniel worried that he'd made a terrible mistake. He began giving them better food, clean water, and a place to shelter from the weather. Slowly they changed. By the second week, they were moving more. By the third, they were climbing farther up the hillside and attacking the thick brush with surprising determination. And by the fourth week, the landscape itself had started to change. Blackberry vines were disappearing. Tall weeds were being stripped down. Thorn bushes that had covered parts of the slope for years were being reduced to broken stems. Daniel could finally see the ground beneath them. That's when he noticed the first strange thing. One afternoon, he walked farther up the slope and came across a flat section of earth. The hillside should have continued downward, but this particular section was almost level. It formed a narrow shelf that stretched sideways across the slope. Daniel stood there for a moment, trying to understand it. He kicked at the dirt and found nothing unusual. Maybe it was an old road. Maybe erosion had created it. He didn't know. So he went back to his chores. But the goats kept climbing. And every time they cleared another section, they exposed a little more of the hillside. A few weeks later, Daniel noticed another flat shelf above the first. Then another. He stopped and looked upward. 3 levels were now visible, running almost parallel across the slope. That didn't look like erosion. Daniel climbed higher. Near the edge of one of the shelves, he found another line of stones. This time, he knew it wasn't random. The stones had been placed side by side, following the curve of the hillside. Some were partially buried, while others were still covered by roots and soil. Daniel crouched down and pulled away the weeds with his hands. More stones appeared. He cleared another section. There were more. Then he stood up and followed the line. It kept going. For several yards, the stones continued along the hillside before disappearing beneath vegetation the goats hadn't reached yet. Daniel stepped backward and looked across the property. The goats were still eating. They had no idea what they were uncovering. Daniel grabbed his phone and began taking pictures. That evening, he called his cousin. "I think there's something up here," Daniel said. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet." He sent the photographs. A few minutes later, his cousin called back. "Those look like terraces." Daniel looked toward the dark hillside through the window. "That was my thought." There was a pause. Then his cousin asked the question Daniel had been thinking about all afternoon. "But who built them?" Daniel had no answer. He had owned the property for 2 years. He had walked parts of that hillside before. He had looked at it from the road countless times. Yet somehow, he had never seen what was underneath all that vegetation. The next morning, Daniel went looking for someone who might know. He didn't have to go far. Mr. Whitfield had lived in the valley for more than 60 years. He had farmed the land below the hillside since he was young, and when Daniel showed him the photographs, the old farmer stared at them for several seconds without saying a word. Then he put on his boots and followed Daniel uphill. They climbed slowly. When they reached the first stone wall, Whitfield stopped. He looked at the stones. Then he walked to the next terrace. Then the next. Finally, he turned toward Daniel. "My father used to talk about these," he said. Daniel looked at him. "You knew they were here?" Whitfield shook his head. "I knew there were supposed to be terraces somewhere on this hill, but nobody had seen them in decades." He crouched beside the stonework and ran his fingers across one of the stones. "My father said they were already old when he was a boy." Daniel looked up the hillside. Now that the vegetation had been cleared, the pattern was impossible to miss. 7 long terraces curved across the slope. And there might have been more beneath the remaining brush. "So what happened to them?" Daniel asked. Whitfield looked toward the valley. "People stopped using them." That was it. No treasure had been buried beneath the hillside. No fortune was waiting in the dirt. There were simply years of neglect. Then decades. Then generations of vegetation growing over something people had once worked incredibly hard to build. Daniel walked the terraces again that afternoon. Now he understood what he was looking at. Those stone walls had been built to hold the soil in place and slow water moving down the slope. They had transformed difficult ground into a series of flatter sections where crops could once have been grown. But Daniel didn't need a long explanation to appreciate what he was seeing. The terraces had survived. The stones were still there. The shape of the hillside was still there. Only the people who knew about them were gone. Until the goats arrived. By late autumn, almost the entire hillside had been cleared. 7 terraces stretched across the slope in long, patient curves, their stone edges visible beneath the afternoon sunlight. The goats were almost unrecognizable from the animals Daniel had purchased 3 months earlier. Their ribs no longer showed. Their coats had filled out. They were stronger, healthier, and constantly moving across the land they had once struggled to climb. The animals everyone had considered worthless had become the reason Daniel could finally see what he owned. One evening, Daniel stood at the top of the hillside and looked down. For 2 years, he'd looked at that property and seen a problem. Too steep. Too overgrown. Too difficult to clear. Now he saw something completely different. Potential. He didn't know yet whether he would restore the terraces or plant crops there. He didn't know how much work the old stone walls would require. And he certainly hadn't become rich overnight. But he had discovered something that money couldn't have shown him. The land had a history. Someone had stood on that same hillside generations earlier and looked at the difficult slope and decided it was worth the effort. Then slowly, the hillside disappeared beneath weeds, until 30 hungry goats came along. The next morning, Daniel walked down the slope with the goats following behind him. He stopped beside the first stone wall and looked at the animals. $60. That was all he had paid. 30 starving goats nobody wanted. He had bought them because he needed cheap labor to clear a difficult hillside. He thought they were going to remove weeds. Instead, they cleared away years of neglect and revealed something nobody in the valley had clearly seen for generations. A forgotten hillside, 7 terraces, and a piece of agricultural history that had been hiding in plain sight. Daniel hadn't bought a fortune for $60. He had bought 30 goats. But those 30 goats helped him uncover something far more important. They showed him that the land he thought was simply overgrown and difficult had once been carefully designed to produce. Sometimes the land doesn't lose its value. Sometimes we simply stop seeing it. And sometimes, all it takes is 30 hungry goats to uncover what was there all along.